Thank you for the opportunity to join you today, and my apologies for not being able to do it in person. So I simply wanted to highlight three features that are emanating from the exploration of the relationship between social inequalities and political cleavages, and conclude with three suggestions for potential future extensions of the exciting work that will be presented today. So the first highlight is to underline the importance of historical analysis. I think that history becomes particularly important to help us to think about our future at times of uncertainty, as the times that we're living through today can be seen as characterized by high levels of uncertainty. And there are many ways of interpreting the historical record, obviously, but two things seem clear. One is that it's characterized by a great diversity of outcomes, and secondly, by constant change. So this historical understanding is important to think about our future, in my view, because it shows that the future is not predetermined, that the current high and often rising levels of income and wealth inequality or processes of dangerous climate change are not inevitable. Secondly, and relatedly to some extent, research on social inequalities and political cleavages highlights the relevance of discourses in shaping social, political, which is widely accepted, but also economic outcomes. The notion that economic outcomes are determined solely by choices of individuals pursuing their self-interest, and that the basis for social choice is the aggregation of those individual interests has consistently been challenged by many people, including Amartya Sen. But what we're seeing now is an interest in understanding the role of discourse, from Robert Schiller's work on narrative economics to Thomas Piketty's Capital and Ideology. I think that we're seeing a much richer description of what determines economic outcomes, and it's relevant because also it opens space for a much wider set of policy options and institutional innovations than the ones that tend to dominate economic policy-making debates. And the third highlight is that the prerequisite for the research that underpins much of the findings and the analysis that we're going to hear about today is the availability of data on social inequalities. And here the work of the World Inequality Lab and the report that was launched this week is particularly important, in my view, in complementing other efforts to document the historical evolution of income and wealth distribution over time and across countries. And that is why we at UNDP remain committed to partner with the World Inequality Lab to support this work. So let me conclude by briefly offering three possible extensions to the important work that is being presented in our session today. First, while recognizing the need to classify people in groups for analysis, for social analysis, I think it's important to be careful with assigning the label identity to one particular classification. We need to be mindful of the fact that people are composed of multiple and overlapping identities. Identity is a plural concept, not fully defined solely by a particular religion, social status, or ideology. And different aspects of one identities acquire salience in different contexts, and many aspects of identity are the result of recent choices, even if often constrained. Secondly, I think that when thinking about social inequalities, we need to go beyond income and wealth inequalities. Actually, even in the most standard welfare analysis, what matters is utility. Income is simply an argument in the utility function, as we all know. But more importantly, people care about more than just one thing, be it utility or income. People care about many things in life, many of which depend on income, certainly, others on aspects that matter intrinsically. So while I argue that data on income and wealth inequality is crucial, people going about their everyday lives are not likely to follow closely the evolution of income and wealth inequality data. And their perceptions of what is or is not fair in society depends on many other factors that go beyond income distribution. And then finally, and somewhat relatedly, I think it is crucial to explore further how the interactions between social inequalities and political cleavages affect what in the human development jargon we call agency. Agency is the ability of people to hold values and make commitments that go beyond something that enhances their own welfare. So people care about justice, about how others are treated, whether that is of direct benefit to them or not. So I believe that the focus on agency is central to enable the processes of reasoning and public deliberation that are so crucial to shape the discourses that are shaping inequalities now, and perhaps more importantly, the way in which they are going to shape them in the future. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying for the last plenary session of this conference. And sorry again, in the name of the will, for the technical difficulties that we are experiencing. So we are very happy to organize this last plenary session around the Political Cleavages and Social Inequalities project. And this is a project that has been coordinated by Amory Gethin, who is here with me today, Thomas Piketty, and myself. But it is a collaborative project in which more than 20 researchers have been involved. So I will start presenting and giving you an overview of the book and the project. And I will present you some of the main results that we have found on the relationship between the political vote and education and income. Amory Gethin will continue presenting the results relating the vote and other socioeconomic dimensions that we have explored in the book. And then we will have two presentations, one by Álvaro Zúñiga on a particular chapter of the book about Mexico and Costa Rica, and Juliet-Nil Uraz will present the chapter on the Middle East. And those are two of the contributors of the book, but we have here today some other contributors as well. So we are very happy to finally be able to present in person the results of this project. So let me start with the motivation behind this project that started being small and ended up being a bit quite large. So there is this fact that we all know, all the inequality scholars will know, that economic inequalities have significantly increased in the last 3-4 decades in most world regions, although at different speeds. But at the same time, these increasing disparities do not seem to have come together with new class cleavages. On the contrary, we have seen the emergence of new identity cleavages, such as the rise of Trump in the US, Le Pen in France, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Brexit in the UK. And the question is then, how can we explain this phenomenon? And this is precisely the goal of this book, to shed new light about these questions by making progress along two different dimensions. On the one hand, a geographical dimension, as we analyze the structure of the vote in 50 electoral democracies, and on the other hand, a temporal dimension, as we aim to cover the longest possible time frame to study the long-run dynamics of political conflict. Again, let me emphasize that this is a collective effort of many contributors to the book, and I will show you in a bit the different chapters to which the different contributors have contributed. So this is the outline for the first part of the talk. I will give you a general overview of the book. I will then present the main results on income, education, and multi-elite party systems. And then Amory will continue presenting the results on religion and socio-cultural cleavages, regional cleavages, generational and gender cleavages, and introduce you to the World Political Cleavages and Inequality database that we have built based on all the data collection that we have done to write the book. So this is the book. The French version was, on the right-hand side, was published in April. The English version is going to be available on December 14th. And let me give you a few words about the philosophy of the project. So the whole aim is to present comparative results about the structure of political cleavages, and in particular, we are interested in answering the following questions. How does the vote for specific parties or coalition vary across time and space? According to different socioeconomic variables, in particular, we are going to be focusing on income, education, religion, age, gender, but we also study other dimensions in the book, such as, for instance, location, etc. The main contribution is really to create and exploit this new database that Amory is going to show you at the end of his talk about the structure of the vote based on electoral surveys that cover more than 500 elections between 1948 and 2020. The book is structured into case studies about the different countries and regions and is preceded by a comparative chapter. And in my intervention and Amory's intervention, I will be presenting this first comparative chapter. And let me emphasize that the objective is mainly descriptive. We aim to document for each country which are the coalitions that exist, who are the voters that support them, and which cleavages are politically represented or not. So this is the structure of the book. As I told you, the first is the comparative chapter, and then we have chapters for Europe on France, the UK, United States, Germany, Northern Europe, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, Southern Europe and Ireland, Belgium, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Austria. We also have a chapter on Eastern Europe. As you can see, there are many different researchers that have contributed to the book. Then if we move to Asia, we have a chapter on India, a chapter on Pakistan, another chapter on Japan, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong. If we move to Latin America, we have a chapter on Brazil, another chapter on Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. Today we will see more in detail how political cleavages have evolved in Mexico and Costa Rica. We also have a chapter on South Africa, if we turn to Africa, and also another chapter on Botswana, Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal. And the last two chapters of the book are on Israel and on Turkey, Iraq, and Algeria. And Juliet is going to present you today the results of this last chapter. So let me present the results on income and education before I pass the word to Amory. So one of the main contributions of the book is to, as I said, is to describe in a systematic manner how the vote varies according to different socioeconomic characteristics. And in particular, in the book, we put the focus on education and income, which are two distinct but complementary measures of social class. And we do that, again, as I said, in an extensive way, try to cover as many years as possible and also as many countries as possible. And one of the striking findings of the book is that we document a gradual process of disconnection between the effects of income and education on the vote. So let me tell you how we document this. So this graph shows the two indicators that we use throughout the whole book. This basically, the indicator is very simple. We calculate the difference between the percentage of top 10% educated voters voting for social democratic, socialist, green, and communist parties, and the bottom 90% of those educated voters voting also for social democratic and affiliated parties. And we do the same we construct the same indicator for income, okay? So top 10% earners voting for the left minus bottom 90% earners voting for the left. And here in this graph, we are depicting the quinquennial average of this indicator for the 12 Western democracies for which we have data since the 1960s until the present. And what you can clearly see is that there has been a clear reversal between the indicator for education and the indicator for income. So if we focus now on education, you need to look at the red line. The highest educated voters used to disproportionately, used to vote less to the left by 15 percentage points in the 1960s. But this gap suddenly started to decrease, even becoming positive in the 1980s, and nowadays this indicator has become positive. And what this shows simply is that while highest educated voters or top educated voters used to vote relatively more for the right in the 60s, they are now disproportionately voting for the left. And if we now turn the focus to income, which is the blue line, and the same indicator, we see that the evolution has been radically different. So there's almost no change in this indicator across time. It has slightly moved from around from 12 points to 10 points, but it has almost remained flat throughout the whole period. And this is what we argue, the shift from a class-based system where high educated voters and top income earners used to have the same type of vote profile, to a multi-elite system where the high educated voters are disproportionately voting more for the left, and top income earners keep voting disproportionately more for the right. And we need to think about this shift in the context of a complete reshuffling of the party systems in the Western world. Again, let me remind you that we are focusing now on the Western world, and we will then turn to the non-Western world. And this graph shows you the transformation of Western party system since 1945. And what you can clearly see is like the share of the vote to social democrats, socialists, communists has declined. In particular, the communist vote has barely, like almost disappeared. And we also see the same for conservatives and Christian Democrats. The vote share has declined over time. And this decline has been absorbed by the Greens and the anti-migration parties that started to gain vote share in the 70s and 80s and have steadily obtained a larger share of the vote at present. If you look at the liberals, which is the orange part of the graph, you see that they have kept a similar vote share at approximately 10% throughout the whole period, but there are important variations across countries. And the reason why we focus on this reshuffling is because, of course, with new parties, like new political cleavages might arise, and they might also attract different segments of the population. And we will see that Greens and anti-migration parties are playing a role in explaining this reversal of the education cleavage. So this figure shows you the same two indicators that I presented before, but instead of at the evolution, like across time, we are simply presenting it for between 1960 and 1980. And what you see again is the same alignment as before. Sorry, you see the same alignment as before. High income and high educated voters disproportionately vote more for conservatives, Christian Democrats, liberals, while low income and low educated voters used to disproportionately vote more for social democrats, socialists, and other left. If we now turn to the present and we look at the 2000 to 2020 period, we see that income still continues to divide the vote to conservatives and the vote to social democrats. However, education no longer is divided along these lines. And we see now that low educated voters disproportionately vote more for conservatives, and high educated voters disproportionately vote more for social democratic and affiliated parties. And interestingly, green and anti-migration patterns are not divided along income. On the contrary, they are divided along education. Okay, and this is important because in the categorization we use, Greens are part of the left and anti-migration are part of the right. So this emergence of these two parties has really exacerbated the reversal of the education cleavages that I have shown you in the very first graph. So you may wonder now, okay, but is this something particular to the Western world, or what do we find in the non-Western world? So if we look at the non-Western world, here we are depicting a slightly different indicator. It's very similar, but bear with me. It's the difference in the percentage of votes among the bottom 50% educated minus the top 50% educated voters, and the same for income. And so on the x-axis, we are representing the income indicator, and on the y-axis, we are representing the education indicator. And what you see here is contrary to what we have been seeing before. Like, there has been a positive correlation between these two indicators. And let me also emphasize that here we are not focusing on left and right. We are looking at the vote, so this difference in the vote to low-income parties, so parties that persistently attract the low-income voters. But what is important to, and what you need to take from this graph, is that we see a positive correlation between these two indicators, and hence we conclude that the transition to a multi-elite party system that we document for the Western world does not seem to be happening in the non-Western world. And we argue that this might be because there are other socioeconomic dimensions that might be interacting with political vote that Amory actually is gonna tell you about. So I pass the word to Amory now.
Thank you very much, Clara. Thank you for being here, all of you. Now I will move on to other types of political divides we've studied in the book. So religious divides, generational divides, socio-cultural divides in a broad sense. So I will go through each of these and try to give you a few findings, a few ideas on the evolution of these divides globally, of course, our 50 democracies. So let's start with religion. So religion is a variable that divides voters and parties in many democracies across the globe. And generally speaking, religious issues have remained an important source of political conflict in many Western and non-Western democracies. So in the West, they have remained very strong. They were historically quite pronounced. So historically, conservative parties, right-wing parties, have always been supported to a greater extent by more religious voters, while secular forces have usually been associated with socialist and social democratic parties. But there are many other countries outside of the non-Western world where we observe significant and to some extent similar divides, whether we are talking about divides between religious minorities and the majority, or between more or less secular voters. So if we look at the Western world, where we see that in all these countries, so here I look at English-speaking and Northern European countries to start with. So this graph shows the gap between voters who are going to church relatively regularly and those who don't, or those who do not have any religion at all. And you can see that it's persistently negative. So religious voters are always more likely to vote for conservative right-wing parties than non-religious voters in general. You can see that it has remained relatively stable, although there are variations across countries. And so this divide does not seem to have really reversed, so it's a bit different from what we observe for education. And religion continues to be a persistent source of political conflict. It's the same if we look at continental and southern European countries. So you can see when comparing the two figures that it's stronger, especially in countries such as Italy and the Netherlands, which have historically extremely strong religious divides, and parties mobilize much more also religious issues. So the gap in Italy, for instance, in the 50s was as high as 40 percentage points, which is really huge. The Italian party system was historically really organized around religion, to some extent more than class. And these are also the countries where class divides, generally speaking, are lower than in other European countries. So there's a sort of relation between higher religious divides and lower class divides in general. Now, if we go outside of the Western world and look at Latin America, Alvaro will talk perhaps a bit more about this, but we see also important variations. But there's also a religious divide that seems to exist in these countries. And again, what's interesting is that countries like Argentina and Brazil are the two countries in Latin America with the strongest socioeconomic or class divides. And at the same time, they are the two countries where religious conflicts seem to be less politicized, to the extent that parties rely less on voters belonging to different religious groups. So a sort of same relation as the one I just mentioned for the case of Western democracies. So in the book, in each chapter, we investigate to what extent these religious divides are strong and how they have evolved over time. And here we plot a few of them, a few countries which are quite interesting to look at, I think. So at the top you have Israel. Israel, I think, is really the country today, in the book at least, which has the most pronounced religious divide. So depending on religious practice, voters are much more likely to vote for conservative parties, or on the contrary, to vote for left-wing parties. And there's a gap of more than 40 percentage points in Israel, so which is much higher than other countries. Turkey is also a case of a particularly strong religious divide, so Juliette will perhaps talk a bit more about this. And India is quite striking because, as you can see, there's always been a divide between the Muslim minority and the Hindu majority, to put it simply. So Muslims have always been more likely to vote for the Congress and left-wing parties in India, so the Indian National Congress that led India to independence. While upper castes have always been traditionally more likely to vote for the Hindu nationalist parties, in particular the BJP. And this gap has increased dramatically over time. So India is really shifting towards greater religious polarization, which is directly linked to the fact that there's been a rise in Hindu nationalism in general, and now the BJP is becoming gradually the dominant party of India. And you can see that there are countries such as Indonesia or Pakistan or Malaysia also have these forms of religious divides, which are relatively persistent over time. So if we go a bit beyond religion, we can look at a broader category, which we propose to call socio-cultural cleavages, which encompasses this large set of identities, we could say, so racial, ethnic, or sectarian identities in general. And our results challenge the idea of a sort of Western exceptionalism. Sometimes we offer, newspapers or very simplistic views of the non-Western world depict democracy outside of the West as being sort of opposing groups depending on these types of identities. Well, it's not really the case. There are very large variations across non-Western democracies in the intensity of these divides. And to some extent, it's the West today that is increasingly tribalizing with, for instance, a very strong divide between immigrants and natives, and an even more marked divide between the Muslim minority in most Western democracies and non-Muslims. So, generally speaking, in the book we try to understand why this is the case, and in what context these types of sociocultural divides are less pronounced. So here we look at the native immigrant divide in Western democracies. So this is in the gap in left vote between immigrants, so those who declare being born outside of the country considered here, and natives. And you can see it's positive in most cases, which means that immigrants are usually much more likely to vote for the left than natives. But there are countries where this gap is not so pronounced, such as Iceland, Finland, or Australia, which points to different politicization strategies of parties probably, and different integration policies. However, when we look at this specific minority, which is the Muslim minority, then we see gaps which are both substantially higher and more generalized to all Western democracies. So you can see, for instance, that in the UK, the gap in votes for the Labour Party between Muslims and non-Muslims reaches more than 40 percentage points. So this is really huge, much bigger than what we saw for income and education. And it holds across really all Western democracies. So in the book, we try to extend this idea to do sort of simple comparative analysis of these divides. And so here on the left, we represent what we call social inclusive parties, so to say. So parties that are both supported by low-income voters of the majority, of the ethnic or religious majority, and social exclusive parties, which are more parties that tend to be supported by low-income voters of the majority, but not at all by the minority. So here you can see, for instance, that in the United States, the Democratic Party, today less and less so, arguably, but especially in the 50s and 60s, it used to be a strongly social inclusive party, gathering both the white working class and the black minority. And on the left, on the contrary, you can see the case of the AKP in Turkey, which is supported by large sections of low-income and low-educated Turkish voters, but not at all by the Kurdish minority. And you can also see that there are countries in the middle of the graph where there are some important ethnic, ethno-linguistic, or religious minorities there. But these do not translate into any sort of political divide. And this is something that I think we should also emphasize. Socio-cultural or ethnic diversity is not synonymous of ethnic conflict. There are cases where there's huge diversity, but there's not necessarily strong ethnic divides. For instance, the case of Indonesia that we discuss in chapter 12. So let me move now to regional divides. So there are two types of regional divides that we study in the book. One is simply this rural-urban divide. The rural-urban dichotomy has always played a role in the West. Traditionally, the rural-urban divide has inhibited class conflicts in the West. Why? Because rural areas tend to be poorer than cities. This is a general fact. But they have always been more likely to vote for the right, especially farmers. So this has contributed to dividing sort of low-income voters on this dimension. And this divide seems to have persisted until today in all Western democracies with no very clear trend over time. On the contrary, in most other democracies in the world, it seems that income and rural-urban location align much more, in the sense that parties that attract votes from low-income voters also attract votes from rural areas. Here we plot the gap in left votes between rural and urban areas in the West. You can see that it has remained negative and relatively stable, although there are variations across countries and a bit of noise. And here, on the contrary, we show that outside of the West, all these red lines on the right are cases where the dominant party that gets support from low-income voters is also the party that is strongly supported by rural areas. Thailand is today the country where the rural-urban divide is the strongest. It's also the country where rural-urban and regional inequalities are the highest. And we discuss in the book how these inequalities have fostered class conflict. So the interaction between these spatial inequalities and the mobilization of poor rural voters plays an important role. And there are only a few cases on the left of parties that are both supported by that are supported by low-income voters, but not by rural areas. And as I just showed before, Western democracies are really unique in a sense in that respect. Let me now turn to region in the broader sense. Okay. So to what extent does regional affiliation determine your vote, and to what extent do parties cluster in different regions? This varies across time and across countries, of course. But a general lesson from the book, I think, is that regional inequalities matter. So regional inequalities are a source of regional conflict. And this is especially the case when geographical inequalities interact with ethnic or sociocultural inequalities. So countries where ethnic groups or religious groups are clustered in different regions and where there are high inequalities between these regions tend to be countries where the party system and political parties divide on regional issues and tend to be clustered in different locations. Okay. India is a very striking case. India has always been a country with high regional divides. Let's remember that India just alone contains more voters than all the other countries before Chapter 9. So all Western democracies combined have less voters than India. So India has several party systems. Each of its regions have different parties. So there's been a very large regional divide in India, and it has increased over time as regional parties have increasingly gathered voters of specific regions. Okay. And there are other countries in the West and outside of the West where regional divides have increased and are very strong. Belgium is a very striking case with the divide between Flanders and Wallonia. Pakistan is another one, and so we try to discuss in the book the reasons underlying the rise of these regional divides. But in the case of Pakistan, for instance, it's really, as I mentioned before, a case where region and ethnic or religious affiliation interact. So Pakistan is divided between various ethnic groups, the Sindhi in the south, for instance, compared to the Punjabi in the north. And there's a huge inequality between these groups. between these groups, and at the same time the party system has always been quite regionally clustered, and parties tend to mobilize voters based on these identities. Let me conclude with generational and gender divides. So generational divides are usually discussed a lot. People tend to think, okay, age is really a crucial factor for understanding voting behavior. We often hear also that generational divides have risen in Western democracies. Well, we don't really find that that is the case. For one thing, generational divides vary a lot over time from election to election, from party to party, and at least in the West, there does not seem to have been a strong rise or decline in generational divides, more sort of fluctuations over time. So left-wing parties have always been more popular among young voters, but this is not more the case today than in the past. Already in the 50s and 60s this was the case, and it's still the case today. So I think this rules out the explanation that there would be a sort of backlash by older voters against social progress or things like that. As we showed before, I think the true reversal that has happened is really about education. Here we look, for instance, at voting for different groups of parties by age, sorry. And you can see, so the green line does show that green parties are always more supported by the youth, but just like left-wing parties used to be more supported by the youth in the 80s or 70s. Meanwhile, if you look at voting for the far right, well, there are large variations actually. In countries such as Switzerland, they are supported more by older cohorts, while in countries like France, typically, younger voters tend to vote more for these parties than older generations. And I will skip this and just go quickly to the gender divide. So outside of Western democracies, there is no clear pattern. This is something that we find. There's no clear tendency of gender divides to increase or decrease or be particularly pronounced. But in Western democracies, there's been a much more structural trend, and a famous result in the literature that we reproduce here with all Western democracies is that there's been a complete reversal of gender divides. In the 50s and 60s, women used to be substantially more likely to vote for right-wing parties. Today, they are substantially more likely to vote for left-wing parties. Italy is a very fascinating case, as you can see, a complete outlier. So in the 50s, women were less likely to vote for the left-wing parties, so here mainly the Communist Party, by more than 30 percentage points. So the Communist Party in Italy was a men's party, put simply. And all these countries have really seen a reversal, which is quite striking, and which can be explained by various facts. But the women's movement, of course, is one of them. The greater concern of women also for environmental issues, generally speaking, is another factor. Oh yes, so let me take 1 minute to present the data set. So this book comes with a website, wpid.world. Feel free to have a look. We have a presentation of the book, of the team. We have this page with many resources that you can download. So many figures, all the figures from the book, many additional figures. Each chapter is available in working paper version and resources by country. And we also have this really interesting, I think, interface where you can plot various indicators of the vote, or you can, so for instance here I reproduce the reversal of the education divide that I presented at the beginning, that Clara presented at the beginning of the presentation. But you can look at many other things in this interface. For instance, if you're interested in seeing who votes for the Democratic Party in the US by income today or in 2002 or in any year, well, you can look at this on the website. So feel free to have a look. To conclude, well, this book is not about having a single conclusion to the question that Clara asked at the beginning. It's more about providing many resources to think about them. So there's no definite answer to why we see a rise in identity-based conflicts in all these countries. I think it depends a lot on country-specific contexts. And there are substantial variations in the ability of parties to politicize inequalities, to mobilize low-income, low-educated voters. New sources and methods should be mobilized to better understand this. For instance, combining local electoral results with demographics at the local level, or looking at parties' strategies in general and what they propose in their manifestos. These are various things that can be explored. So I hope that you can enjoy this resource and that future research can help us answer these various questions. And now I leave the floor to Alvaro, who will present our chapter on Latin America.
Hello, everybody. So I'm very happy to present this. This comes from the chapter that we wrote with Oscar, Ana, Clara, and myself, chapter 15. The chapter touches 6 countries, as you can see: Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. But today I will concentrate on Costa Rica and Mexico, which have some things in common and also some things are very different, and that's also why I chose them, and I think they are a good illustration of what's going on in Latin America. But before I jump into Costa Rica and Mexico, I want to give you a general overview of what we find for Latin America in general. So we find that, as you can probably imagine, this is also in the imaginary, Latin America are characterized by personalist leaderships in many cases, not all, but in many cases. There are important historical cleavages. For example, the one in Costa Rica I will talk about in a short while. These 2 things, these 2 points, make it for a blurry class-based voting pattern in most cases, but not in all of them. Countries like Brazil, which is in a different chapter, and Argentina, they have very clear voting patterns. In general, in the southern cone, the countries of Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay have more class-based politics, but it's a little bit blurry in the rest of the region. So this makes, for cases of competing, what we call in the book pro-poor and pro-rich countries, parties in some countries, and also ethnic-based competing coalitions. So the pro-poor, pro-rich will be Costa Rica, for example, while the ethnic-based competing coalitions will be in Peru. All of this is to say that the multi-elite system that was described before by Amory and Clara doesn't always apply to Latin America. And this is partly why I chose Costa Rica and Mexico, because Costa Rica is a case where there is no multi-elite, and Mexico is a case where there is multi-elite, and we will see it shortly. So basically there are 2 groups of party systems: those that are more institutionalized party systems, as I said, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico are less volatile. And then there are other cases like Costa Rica, Colombia, and Peru that where the cleavages change for different reasons and not necessarily for the ones described in Western democracies. So without further ado, I'll jump into Costa Rica. So this is the entire political history of the country in the last 70 years or so. So the story in Costa Rica is that it went from a 2-party system to a multi-party system. So for the full second half of the 20th century, the political struggle was dominated by 2 parties: the Green Party, which is called National Liberation Party, which was or is a center-left party, and the Social Christian Unity Party, the one in blue, which was a center-right party. So the story begins at the end of the 1940s, when there was a civil war in the country, which was the last armed conflict in the country. There was a civil war. The winners of the war took control of the country for 18 months. There was a junta, and after 18 months, they gave back power to those that they believe had rightly won the previous election. That those winners governed for 4 years, and then ever since, political party has been alternating between the center-left and the center-right. But things changed in the 2000s when there was a new party, the Yellow Party. The Citizens Action Party came into play, and ever since, other parties have come into the game. Just to give you a little bit of context on the Yellow Party started its political history calling themselves the rightful social democrat, the rightful center-left, because as in many countries, the whole party system moved a little bit to the right. So what used to be the center-left became the center, and then the Yellow Party started calling themselves the true center-left. So this is the big context. Because this is messy, we don't present the results of Costa Rica as in left and right, because it's complicated to put parties together. If you read the chapter, you will see it. So in theory, we should put the Green Party and the Yellow Party together because they have both been social democrats at some point. But we don't do it because we wouldn't be able to see what we see here. So what we see here is that in the last 5 decades, we have such long data in Costa Rica that we can aggregate elections by decades. In the last 5 decades, the dominant party, which was the National Liberation Party, the green one, went from being more voted by the higher income deciles to being to be voted by the lower income deciles. As you can see, there was a transition period in the 1990s when actually the dominant party became the blue party. And after the 1990s, in the 2000s and 2010, the Green Party is mostly voted by the low-income voters. While the other party of the past, the Blue Party, transitioned from being always voted in the last 4 decades by the lower-income deciles to be now more voted by the higher-income deciles. So that's the story of the 2 main parties. Then the new parties have come to play different roles in the political system. So for example, the Yellow Party that came into existence in the 2000s and is the party that broke this 2-party system has always been voted by the more, by the better off. And there was a new party that came into existence in the last election, which is the National Restoration Party, which you can imagine is a Costa Rican version of Bolsonaro, so it's the evangelical and Christian party, is mostly voted by the low income levels. This is the story that justifies in the chapter what we call pro-rich and pro-poor. But I know that has made some readers uncomfortable, and I want to explain this very clearly. It comes from this graph and from this idea. And what I want to say is that there is a distinction between who votes for that party, which is what we show here, which is what appears in the surveys, and who are the leaders of those parties. So obviously, like in many other parts of the world, the Green Party, which is now mostly voted by low-income voters, the leadership of the party are not themselves low-income, right? And in Latin America happens that many parties that are voted for by the poor are also highly supported by the economic elites. And this is a very important point, which is also the case of the party, the Evangelical Christian Party, which is voted by the poor but supported by the economic elites. And that combination of things happens. But that's just a complement to the idea that we put together in the book, where we actually reflect what we see in surveys. And what we see in surveys is who votes for who. That's what I wanted to say there. So, the education cleavage in Costa Rica, it tells a similar story, and this is why we cannot talk about a multi-elite system in Costa Rica. The fact that the 2 pictures look very similar, as you can see, this is income and this is education, is what tells us that there is no multi-elite system. So, the richer vote very similar to the more educated. And this is not what is happening in Western democracies. So there are several reasons to explain this. Most likely, there is a high skill premium in Costa Rica, as in many other developing countries. So those that we observe in the survey as the better off people, those with a higher income, are also the better educated. And that's how they vote. So we basically confirm the observations in education that we get from income. And that will be the case of Costa Rica. Now, to jump onto Mexico, I said there were some things in common. The main thing in common with Mexico is that it's a transition from a one-party system, if you can call that a party system, but from one-party system to a multi-party system. That's what it's in common. What is not in common is precisely the fact that Mexico has a shorter history with democracy. Even though they claim that there was a democracy since the 1920s, when the major party, the Green Party, came into existence after the Mexican Revolution. So the party came into existence in the 1920s and governed the country for 71 years. Of course, if you ask a pre-politician at the time, they will tell you that they had democracy. It's just that people always voted for them, right? But things have changed in Mexico for the better, and that's the good part of the story. So the 1960s and 70s was a period when the PRI exercised the more authoritarian control of the country. There was, you might have heard of the infamous Tlatelolco Massacre in 1968. So at the same time as there were student manifestations in France in 68, there were in Mexico, except that in Mexico they killed many students. And the peak of that period is that point that you see in 1977, when there was only one candidate for the election, right? And people voted for that candidate, and he won. That's the best part of the story. So the political history of Mexico is one of democratization, but in a combination of reforms, political fraud. There was political fraud that brought riots, and that brought reforms, and so on and on in a dynamic system. Until at the end of the 1990s, in the elections of the 2000, there was the first time that the PAN, the center-right party, won, or more right than the PRI, won the election, and there was peaceful transition of power. And not only they won that election, but they won the following one. So we can talk about a democratization process in Mexico, and those are the good news. Although the history of the 20th century is very different from the one in Costa Rica. Here, I know Mexicans don't like how we group together the left, the PRD and Morena, especially because nowadays they cannot see each other. But again, for the purpose of the book, we are analyzing right versus left, and in some cases we separate by parties, and we thought this is analytically useful. We are not claiming that the two parties are the same, of course. So Mexico, as opposed to Costa Rica, does have a multi-elite party system, as you can see. So the red line are those, is the difference between the top 10 in income and the bottom 90 in income. So that means that those that are better off has historically voted less for the left, while the blue line, you can see that those that are more educated have historically voted more for the left. And in this sense, it looks more like a Western democracy. Now, if we look party by party, what we see is that in terms of education, the PRI has always been supported by the less educated. The PAN, which is the first party who ever won an election other than the PRI, has historically been supported, except for 2 decades, mostly supported by those that are more educated. It's important to see that the kink in the 2000s is precisely the decade where PAN won 2 elections. So that was the decade when the PAN managed to get support from other income and education groups to actually remove PRI out of power. So that's not surprising that they came down a little bit in the education. While the left has historically been supported by the more educated in the 1990s, and again now in the 2010. And the income cleavage is a similar story. So the PRI has historically been supported by those that are less rich, while the PAN has been supported by those that are richer. It's interesting to see how the left, again, we are grouping together the main political actors of the left, they move from being supported by those that were less better off to those that are better off in the last decade. And with that, I think I'll conclude saying that in the Latin American chapter, we have many different cases. We cannot group together our Latin American countries and say that the political system works in one way or the other. But I think we find analytical elements to say that political cleavages have been changing in the region, and that goes in line with what was said just before, that we don't, in this book and in this chapter also, we are not trying to answer with one unique answer to the question that was asked in the beginning. And in this sense, it's interesting to see the graph that you saw before on where Costa Rica was, the graph that Amory presented, where Costa Rica was, the left was not supported, for example, for those that are mostly excluded, And that brings the idea, for example, that in Costa Rica, the issue or the topic of issue voting is more important than the issue of socioeconomical cleavages, for example. So that's just an example of how things work differently in different Latin American countries. So I think my time is up, and I will stop there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for still being here, and I hope you're excited to hear about the Middle East, which is the last session we'll have after this full day of conference. So I'm going to present you the last chapter of the book, actually, which is on Algeria, Iraq, and Turkey, which is a joint work with Lydia Aswad Amory, which is here, and Thomas. So I will proceed in like 3 main steps, going to why did we decide to include the Middle East and North Africa region in the book, despite like concerns that you could have about irregularities of elections or, lack of democracy and everything. And then what type of question we could address with the data we had at our disposal. And last, I will just try to give you some flavor of the results. It's going to be frustrating, and I hope you're going to just read the paper to know what's going next. So why the Middle East? Well, I think I could have changed this to say that actually the Middle East and North Africa region is not only one of the most unequal regions, but what the WEED report I've just disclosed yesterday is that it might be actually the most unequal region in the world in terms of income distribution. And you're now familiar with this type of graph coming from the WEED website, basically showing you the share of national income held by top 10%. So if you look at the red line, this is a share held in the Middle East and North Africa, which is close to 65%, which is way above what we observe in the US and Western Europe, for instance, and which is really close to what we have in the most unequal country in the world, like Brazil, and only South Africa is a bit above this. The second motivation for including the Middle East and North Africa region in this book is basically that inequality has been at the heart of political conflict and of massive protest movement in the region. So we might all have in mind the Arab Springs of 2011, but for the 3 countries that we are studying here, actually their own political momentum happened later. So they have not been really affected by the Arab Spring, but they all had massive protest movement where we observed demand for fair redistribution, anti-elite, anti-corruption stance, and not really ethno-religious conflict playing a huge role anymore. So here you have like some pictures about Algeria and Iraq, where we have this new Arab Spring, which has been shaking the 2 countries before the pandemic and actually led to new elections in 2021, which are not covered in this chapter. The second dimension for including the Middle East and North Africa is actually this shift that we observe in the region since the 90s to identity politics. So if we take the case of Iraq, after the US invasion and the fall of Saddam Hussein regime, they put in place what we call a sectarian system, which recalls a bit the feature of Lebanon, which you might be more familiar with. And the idea is basically that you share the power between the different ethno-religious groups that compose the country. So the main ethno-religious divide in Iraq are between the Sunni and Shia Muslim, and on the ethnic side between the Arabs and the Kurds. And so basically, even if it's not a formal arrangement, each ethno-religious group will be represented in the government, despite the fact that they will not win election. So if you look at who wins election in Iraq, it will not tell you who is going to have every single minister's seat, basically. Like it's just an informal arrangement that is changing at every election, but it's always in place, and which is still the case now. So that's what we call the sectarian system. And the second aspect of the story is basically the rise of political Islam that we observe both in Algeria and in Turkey, which is actually really interesting because these 2 countries used to be really strong secularist countries in terms of like the dominant party in both of them since the independence in Algeria in 1962 and since the establishment of the Republic in 1923 in Turkey were promoting the idea that basically politics should not be influenced at all by Islam, and we're adopting the same stance that what we had in France, basically, like the division between the state and the church. But in both countries, so first in Algeria at the early 90s, an openly Islamic party won election. So in Algeria, it led to a really deadly civil war, which extended for a decade, while in Turkey, the AKP, which is still in power today, was not the first political Islam party to run for election and to win an election, but the first one which managed to stand in power continuously since then, so since almost 2 decades now. So the question we have been trying to address, which is basically the same one that we have in the book, is how this social polarization in terms of income and education, or at least this really high level of inequality that we observe in the data, interacts with the change in the political cleavages, so both the rise of sectarian system and political Islam in the entire region. So here we only have case studies, but we do think that our results might hold in other settings, and we will be more than happy to see similar work being extended throughout the region. The main problem is data availability. So, I mean, we hope that at some point we will have more data on this region, but what we don't have is exit poll surveys. So what we ideally would like to know is who vote for whom for each elections, but also all the socio-demographic characteristics of voters. So here what we use is 3 national representative opinion surveys, the World Value Survey, the Arab Barometer, and the comparative studies of electoral system, which have not been designed for electoral purposes, but we have all this information, and they're also designed in a cross-country comparative perspective. And this allows us to cover almost all elections in Turkey for 3 decades, in Iraq for 15 years, and for 2 decades in Algeria. So in terms of results, I'm going to try to give you some simplified story. So it's just to have like a punchline for every single country, but happy to go back to this in the discussion. So first, let's start with Iraq, which is the most extreme case actually among the entire book in terms of sectarian divides. So basically, sectarian meaning ethno-religious division. So here you have the vote for the Shia Islamic list by the region, and you can take the region as a really good predictor of your ethno-religious identity, because all the different groups in Iraq are predominantly concentrated in well-defined areas. So even if you have mixed places like Baghdad, which is in red here, in the south of Iraq, which is in yellow, you have predominantly the Shia part of the population. In the midwest of Iraq, which is in blue here, you have the Sunni part of the population. So what this graph is telling you is basically that if you are living in southern Iraq, you're more likely to vote for the Shia Islamic list by more than 70%, except in 2018. So you can already see that something's definitely happening here, and we would most likely have the same result for the last election, which happened a month ago. So what is the other side of the story? Like, what about the socio-economic determinants of voters? Well, what happened in 2018 is that for the first time, what we define the opposition has been completely reshaped. So even if the system was sectarian, not all parties were affiliated on an ethno-religious basis. Like since the start, we always had parties which were either defining themselves as secularist, so refusing to identify themselves with a political Islam dimension, or were taking an anti-sectarian, anti-system stance. And so in 2018, for the first time, you have one party which was affiliated with the Shia, so with political Islam list, which decided to unite itself with the historically secularist communist. So it was a formal coalition, which was a completely new player, which decided to actually take a pro-poor stance, and which reshaped the cards in the political arena. So here, what I'm showing you is the vote for this opposition, both secular and anti-sectarian list, among the poorer voters. And the question we were asking is basically, did this new coalition, which arrived in 2018, has been able to change something in the Iraqi politics? And basically, if your line differs from the bold line, so if you're farther away from the 0, it means that the poorer voters have a voting behavior which is significantly different from the rest of the population. So what you observe basically is that before 2018, not so much is going on, maybe except at the start of the period, but you're really close to the 0 line. But like in 2018, we're getting a really significant support for the opposition among the low-income part of the population. So even if this is small, this still means that we should, or we could, investigate in more depth the electoral composition of this anti-sectarian opposition and try to see if actually socioeconomic characteristics are playing a new role in Iraqi politics. So do we have something similar in Turkey? So Turkey used to be this outlier of the Middle East, especially because they have a multi-party system since aftermath of World War II, and also because basically we have strong class-based voting, at least historically, in the country. But what happened in 2002 is the election of the AKP, which was openly claiming its Islamic identity, taking as a model the Christian Democrats of Germany, for instance. and we didn't have any problem with saying that they were defining themselves this way. So here, the question we're asking is whether religion is playing a new role in politics in Turkey. So you have the difference of voting between the religious and non-religious people. There's a religious cleavage that Amory was talking to you about. If you're voting for the right or the Islamic parties, that's a green line. And if you're voting for the opposition, which used to be defined as secularist and often put on the left side of the spectrum, it's the red one. So you do observe a really strong religious cleavage because the percentage point difference is around 30%. But what is most interesting is that this cleavage didn't really change over time. So we rather have a persistence of the religious cleavage and not something happening only with the election of the AKP which in 2002, which will be in the middle of your graph. So even if religion seems to be really important in Turkish politics, it doesn't seem to give you so much explanatory power about the recent dynamics. So this definitely calls for looking at other dimensions, and especially income and education. Here you have the vote for the AKP by income quintiles since their second mandate in 2007, because we don't have data for the first mandate. And what is really interesting, I think, is to see the support among the poorer part of the population, which is the blue bar here, so 20% poorer earners. Then you can see that their support for the AKP has been higher than 50% continuously over the 2 decades. But at the same time, even if you look at the upper middle class that, let's say, is captured by the fourth quintile, you also have a support which is above 40%. So even if the AKP seems to capture the religious part of the population, which used to be already be captured by the right wing in Turkey, now it seems that actually the AKP has managed to define itself as pro-poor, or at least to be supported by this part of the population while having also the support of the elite, which Alvaro also described for Costa Rica, right? If I have some time left, yeah, let's have a little picture for Algeria. So for Algeria, we're now turning to the vote of top income voters for two parties, which initially were radically different in terms of ideology. So the red line is showing you the FLN, which is the historically dominant party in the country, which has been running the country continuously in this type of one-party dominant system since the independence in 1962. And on the blue line, you have the RND, which is a new party created in the 90s, which defined itself as technocratic, which has been supporting all the liberalization and structural reform pushed forward by the IMF. So which would you rather put on the right aspect of the spectrum? So the FLN always adopted a pro-poor stance and also located itself as a socialist, while the RND was really seen as this new right-wing neoliberal party. So at the start of the period, in 2002, this seems to make sense. Like if you're a top income voter, you're more likely to support the right-wing technocratic party, which is the RND, and less likely to support the FLN, which is a pro-poor one. So ideological difference seems to be captured by this class-based difference. But at the end of the period, in 2017, this difference is cancelling out, which would mean basically that this class-based dimension, or at least ideological / class-based dimension, is disappearing. And one of the interpretations we are pushing forward is maybe that this could reflect the perceived collusion between the two parties among the population. Because even if these two parties seems to be radically different, they actually have been governing together through coalition, backing each other and supporting the presidential candidate, especially throughout the time. So a lot of people are actually saying that in Algeria we have a cartel type of system where this type of coalition allow you to capture both the poorest part of the population, so the bottom 50%, and the economic elite. And by having these cross-class alliances, you can basically stand in power, except if the differences are not working anymore and that the discontent spread across social groups. So this is something we have been trying to investigate a bit, just showing you how abstention and discontent spread actually not only among the poorest part of the population, but across all the different social groups. So just to conclude, I think the main takeaway for the Middle East is like you should not only look at the identity lens, because most of the time it will not give you any explanatory key. So that might differ a bit from the other region in the world, but what we're calling is for reintegrating social inequalities in the story, looking at income education, composition of the electorate, but also think that the Middle East and North Africa region, which has been really understudied in comparative politics, can actually be a topic of quantitative research. Because even if the data has a lot of limits, and we have no problem with recognizing the shortcomings of it, data do exist. And if you do actually show the limits of the data, you could also spur further data collection. So there's a new trend of research on this, and I think this is really worth looking at. On time, right?
Thank you very much, Juliette. Now we'll have a few questions. So we'll all settle down here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Very interesting. Very simple question to start with. How did you approach participation to elections?
So you're right to point that out. Turnout is not something that we study explicitly in this book. It's an important limitation. One of the reasons is that data on turnout is very difficult to get, and generally speaking, the surveys we use tend to underestimate turnout and yield results of turnout inequality, which are also found to be biased in the literature. So here, the book is more about which kinds of social groups parties capture than about who votes and who does not vote. But I do believe this should be done in the future. Unfortunately, the surveys that we use are really well known for not representing this accurately. There are a few countries where we do show results for turnout, but I really hope this can be done in the future.
Thanks a lot. This fascinating research, and I'm looking forward to read the book. I have a question maybe related to this, which is about how do you deal with dictatorships, periods of dictatorships. Maybe it's related to Latin America, but also in Europe. Spain, for example, or I mean, the sample, this is the one that I can point out, where the vote actually was, so dictatorship would establish itself and it would use techniques as to be in power, let's say. So how do you deal with this?
So maybe I can say some few words about Western world, and then we turn to Latin America. I don't know if this is, do you hear me? Yes? Okay. So in general, we try, I mean, that's why I think Amory made the point that we tend to call our countries, the countries that we focus, electoral democracies, because sometimes it's hard to say that some countries that we focus on are actual democracies. So in the case of the Western world, we start collecting the data whenever there are like electoral democracies. So for instance, in the Spanish context, we start in the transition period. I think the very first survey we have is in 1979. So of course, this is a tumultuous period in which still parties are building, but we try to be as consistent as possible to find these two coalitions. As you saw, for instance, and I will pass the word to Alvaro, like in the context of Mexico, I think it's one of the most extreme contexts, because you have really a very, very, very low share for the other party that is not the PRI. So there, I mean, the reason why we still wanted to show this period is to really document like this transition from a one-party system to a multi-elite party system. But I think it's very hard to make any statements about the structure of political cleavages in this specific period, because we don't have like really a two-party system. But in general, I think our aim is to really start whenever there are a sufficient number of parties, or at least a sufficient share of the vote that is attributed to parties.
Yes, for Latin America, is the first part of the answer is very similar. So there are two parts. The first is we only analyze the period after the dictatorships. So for example, in the case of Chile, which is one of the latest, we have the first election in the transition period, I think in 88, 89, and after that in the 1990s. So it's first, the focus is when there is something functioning, when there is some kind of democracy functioning, and second, we are limited by data. So there is no data when there is really dictatorships. So in that sense, we only look at the period without. And the other thing that I wanted to say, and the case of Mexico is complicated because there is data in the previous decades, and some people will say that was not functional democracy. But first, we have interesting results. So we see the transition of vote for PRI, for example, and vote for other parties. So it's still useful to look at those decades. And second, Mexico is complicated, but for example, we have a survey in the 1970s where we use parliamentary elections as opposed to presidential elections. And in that period in Mexico, there was a little bit more freedom to have more parties in parliament than there was to have parties for president. So that allow us to observe something interesting, but you have to be creative, and in that case we look at a different type of election. Still like national election, but we look at a different type of election.
You had these two reversals based on gender and education, and I was wondering what happens when you control for education on the gender regression.
Thanks. So all the figures we show control for all other variables available. We also have a paper that came from this chapter where we formally look at these different interactions. For instance, how much of the reversal in the educational divide that we observe is driven by the fact that women who have become more educated have also become more left-wing. So we would think that this plays a role. But once you try and bring all these variables together, you find that that's really not the case. Like less than 1% or 2% of the changes we observe are compositional in nature. All others are holding after controls. So these compositional shifts do not play any role in what we observe, generally speaking.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I found it very interesting. I found the indicators quite creative and some very fresh applications. I was very inspired actually. I think it's very interesting to see on the one hand how these different countries develop so differently, and now with this big database there's this huge potential to use the aggregate data and to do some econometrics models and make up some results. So I was wondering, I mean, this is very daunting, and there's I think a lot of things to be found there, but also one should be careful. So I was just wondering if you have any idea if there's any patterns that you would like to observe in the future, or if you have any specific things that you would like to put a little more on the aggregate maybe also.
I can tell you one idea I have, but it's a bit specific to the Western world and particular to the country where I'm from. So one of the things when we realize when we look at regional vote, and in particular focusing within countries, at the difference in the vote between the capital and the rest of the country. One interesting thing that we find is that, for instance, in the Spanish context, the capital of Spain, Madrid, is the only of the capitals in Europe where you see that high educated voters, where you see that high educated voters disproportionately vote more for the right. And this is in contrast to what we see, for instance, in Paris or in London, in Rome, etc. So I always had that in mind, that I was thinking that it would be nice if someone could, for instance, explain why is it the case that that these regional cleavages are different across countries. But I mean, I think there are many questions that arose when we started to look into the data that we unfortunately cannot tackle. But yeah, that's one aspect that I think it would be worth exploring more. And I think the other thing that could be interesting is we try to be exhaustive in the data collection, and actually our choice of countries depends largely on the data availability. But I think there are still countries that are not part of the book that could be worth exploring, and that might have different dimensions of political conflict that we have not identified here. So yeah, I think it would be also nice to expand, and if someone is interested, please let us know, to expand the analysis to more countries, and we would be very happy to include more people into the project and collaborate more with other people interested in that.
Yeah, I would add there are maybe two things I think are two examples of how the database can be used. So one is, after the book, we wrote this paper where we tried to shed light on the reasons underlying the reversal of the educational divide. And so to do that, we combined data on voting by education for each party from this data set with manifesto data on which kind of policies parties emphasize. And we found that there was a strong and rising correlation between the emphasis of parties on socio-cultural issues, generally speaking, from the environment to immigration, and this educational divide, which goes with what Clara was showing about the fact that Greens and anti-immigration parties are mostly different on the education gradient. So this is something that can be done, matching this data on who votes for which parties with what parties propose, to better understand how these cleavages come from different types of conflicts. Another interesting thing, I think, from the book is what I was talking about before, the fact that regional divides or ethnic divides tend to be strongest when inequalities between these groups tend to be highest. This is something that has not been explored much in the comparative politics literature, I think. And it's, I think, an interesting regularity that could be tested using this data and other data. So these are the kind of relations that can be discussed in comparative perspective. I think the book and the data set asks more questions than it provides answers, of course. But these are the type of relations that I think are interesting to explore.
Sorry, a quick follow-up on the first one. So did I get it right? You did like a polymetric analysis, like with the manifesto project of what the parties were representing. Is this already published, the paper?
Yes, it's published.
Okay. What's the title?
The title is Brahmin Left versus Merchant Right, Changing Political Cleavages in Western Democracy.
Thank you.
And maybe I can add another thing that one of the limitations that we have with these electoral surveys is that we couldn't relate wealth to political vote because there were very few surveys where wealth was available. And I think really relating political vote to wealth is important because we see that the division might be even larger between between rich and poor than in the case of income. We have some evidence for France, but yeah, I mean, like trying to get more or census data or any data to really look at wealth and the relationship between wealth and political vote is something that could be also worth doing. Again, I think it's really limited by data availability, but I'm pretty sure that like there might be some sources, maybe in Scandinavia or countries where data availability is better, where this could be explored.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me properly? Yeah, I was quite intrigued by one of the early slides in your presentation. I'm sitting here.
Sorry, I was looking for
yeah,
sorry.
I saw you looking around. Where you were showing that this sort of this movement where educational cleavages and income cleavages are moving away from one another in terms of the voting behavior. You were saying that this is actually the opposite picture in a set of countries that perhaps we should define as developing countries, but you didn't go into much detail on what we were seeing there. So I'm quite curious, what would explain that in a certain group of countries with certain characteristics, there is this alignment, and in another group of countries with a different set of characteristics, there's this disalignment. And what would be the factor then that explains these two different patterns that apparently are happening in parallel in the same world? Is it income? Is it how long these democracies have existed? I'm just really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't know if you want to explain Turkey, because it's an interesting case where it's not like us, but I don't know.
I think there are some cases outside of Western democracies where we have some sort of multi-elite party systems, or to some extent a divergence of income and education. One that I study in chapter 11 is Japan. Japan in the 50s and 60s used to have the dominant party, the Liberal Democratic Party, used to be supported by low-income voters, but mainly also by the elites, economic elites, while higher educated voters voted much more for secular parties. So there was a strong separation between these two, which was linked to some extent to the strength of socio-cultural divides, again, to come back to them, very different kinds of socio-cultural divides, divides emphasizing more war memory, attitudes towards the US, attitudes towards Japan's past, and in particular towards remilitarization after World War II. So I would say that, coming back to this paper that we did after the book, socio-cultural divides are one factor that can drive the divergence between these two dimensions, because education is strongly linked two beliefs on these types of issues. And there's also an interesting case of a divergence. That's Turkey, I think, a bit. Turkey, the Turkish party system was used to oppose a sort of more secular center-left party, which has always been considered to be the party of the intellectual elites, right? I'm speaking under Juliet's control. While the right has always been more tilted towards economic elites, although of course economic elites have colluded in both parties. Why do many non-Western democracies see an alignment of these two dimensions? Well, perhaps it's because the separation of education and income are more the exception than the norm, I would say. Yeah. But it's still very difficult to know the exact reasons for that.
I think that's the point where history comes into the game, right? And like, it's really difficult to find patterns for all the developing words, because like, you could just take the Turkish case, for instance. You cannot understand it without having like the full history of the multi-party system. And like, actually, if you look at how top income voters vote in Turkey, you have almost half of them voting for the right and half of them voting for the left. Like, it's perfect intra-elect conflict. And a way to understand it is education, but also because education has been part of a really strong nation building system, right? Like, education was a policy put forward by the dominant system since, I would say, the aftermath of World War II, and then a way to convert the new elite of the system. And this is something we observe in many countries, I guess also in Latin America, if you have like the top, like the highest educators voted for the right?
Yes, so I think I mentioned it briefly in the presentation. So to explain, for example, the case of Costa Rica and Colombia and why we don't observe the multi-elite, we came to the conclusion it has to do with the high skill premium in those countries. So in those countries, it's very unlikely that somebody who's highly educated is also not in the top percentiles. While if you think of Europe, it's not weird that somebody with a PhD is not very rich, right? So that's how we explain it. That's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that I mentioned briefly at the end, the importance of issue voting, and how that is driving vote for left parties in some countries, like in Costa Rica, and also the fact that there is something I didn't say about Mexico, which is Mexico is a case where you have multi-elite, that I said, but what I didn't say or I didn't dwell into is that we classified the main party, the PRI, as a right-wing party, right? Although it's called the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. I don't know how you put all of those words together, but that's the name. So it was born after the revolution, and it was supposed to be a left-wing party at some point. But all political scientists coincide that it's not a left-wing party now. And I'm saying all of this because Latin America is one of those cases where the parties move very much to the right in the political spectrum. And if there was some doubt that the PRI in Mexico was not a right-wing party, then the end of the 1980s and the 1990s proved that it was, with all the neoliberal revolution, let's say, or movement, and when all the national companies were sold, and that explains, for example, the emergence of Carlos Slim, but also how the party, who was the party of the revolution and was a secular party, reinterpreted its relation with the church, for example, in those years. So for all of those reasons, we didn't put PRI in the left, and that allowed us to arrive to the conclusion that in Mexico we see a multi-elite system. So that's one annotation I wanted to make.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we will close now the last plenary session. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end of the conference, for all the nice discussions. And yeah, we hope to see you in the third World Inequality Conference in 2 years from now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alvaro, Clara, Amory, Juliette, for your presentation and for this work. Let me just say one word for the end of this conference. I think, this panel was a great example of frontier research in economics and how to integrate different disciplines together. We're discussing in the first session as well how inequality researchers are encouraged and can gain a lot from integrating different disciplines, political science, sociology, history, economics, and I think this is a great example of that. Now let me thank all of you for being here at this conference in person. It was challenging. It was challenging for the organizers, and I would like to thank everybody who was invested in this organization. I know it was a challenge for all of us, so thank you very much for bearing with us this time. We hope that next time that we meet, this will be a post-COVID world, and that we'll be able to enjoy also all the social events that were initially planned for this conference. We were supposed to have a cocktail right now. We had to cancel that due to safety regulations, but there will be better days in terms of COVID, and there will also be many more conferences on inequality, so looking forward to see you all here in Paris or in other places of the world. Thank you very much once again, and good evening.